Hello, this video is an accompaniment to a paper which I submitted as a thesis for a qualification which I did in the history of rock and roll. Now the title of the paper was the progression of British guitar music from 1964 to 1990. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some of the themes interspersed with some playing that will show it. So the reason I started in 1964 is very particular. Prior to 1964, of course, there was British guitar music, there was skiffle, there was people like the Shadows, Hank Marvin, probably being the first guitar hero, but they really were imitating sound rather than creating anything specifically new in a rock and roll context. So the reason why we started in 1964 is because that's the time when something really game-changing happened. So following a fight in a studio between two brothers in a band, sounds like we could be in the mid-90s, but actually the Gallaghers were old hat, they were 30 years out of date, because way back in the 1960s there was a band that had two brothers that didn't get on as well, and following a fight in a studio there was damage to an amp, and that allowed them to create a sound which went on to be known as the fart box. Not the greatest name for something that revolutionised guitar music, but the first song which had that included in it was this song. And that, of course, is You Really Got Me by the Kinks. And that sound that was generated was the first time that power chords were recorded. So really everything from that point forward, heavy rock, heavy metal, all came from that one fight with that damaged amplifier. So that was the real the first change that British guitarists had on rock music through something that they'd done in their playing. And the next change came in 1965 when a band who had been around for 2 years, but primarily up to that point, their duo songwriters had been recording for other people, and their debut release album was mainly covers. And they were heavily influenced by American blues and by Chess Records. And when they went over to America and started recording, re-releasing this stuff, they actually thought they were a tribute to the black blues musicians which had come before, but American white folks hadn't heard it, so they were selling their own music back to them. So in 1965, this song came out, and it really did be the first time that blues had been used in rock to influence record sales and be able to sell music to the new market, which it was originally aimed at. Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones, which was written and released in 1965 after Keith Richards thought of it in a dream, woke up, recorded it, fell back to sleep, and in his stupor forgot it. Someone played him the tape back the next day and he said, "I like that, what's that?" And he'd written it the night before. So then we move into blues becoming more influential and easier to access, and clearly a lot of these guys were influenced before, but it was hitting the mainstream for what was happening to them. And then some graffiti started around London, and this guitarist who had been around for a few years, primarily in bands like John Mayall's Blues Breakers or the Yardbirds, but it really was when he in the Yardbirds was when he really started to get his acclaim, and he went off and he didn't form, but he took part in what was kind of recognised as rock's first supergroup. And they started influencing. There was a lot of African beats from the drums, but there was a lot of blues from the guitar, melodic harmonies with a low voice and a high voice, and it really did change lots of things. And they would be recording stuff like this. That graffiti that appeared everywhere proclaimed Clapton is God around London in the 1960s, and the band was Cream, and that song Sunshine of Your Life is remembered by lots as their signature tune, especially that riff. And then we move forward and we have things happening more organically in different areas of the country at that time. So there was 3 bands formed at this time, all formed around the same time with different influences that went on to shape music in their own way. So whilst the blues was influencing London, the Midlands was creating more darker sounds. And there was a band formed in, I think, 1969, because they formed and released almost straight away rather than working their way up, that went on to define this infusion of blues and heavy rock for around the next decade. And it took because they had two musicians from London, one a virtuoso recording musician that could play about anything, one another guitarist who had found his way through the Yardbirds guitar school, how that band probably had the greatest list of guitarists ever with the three people that went through those doors. And the two that came from the Midlands, long-haired, blonde, curly-haired singer, and probably the greatest rock drummer in history, all combined to make a sound which was more bluesy but more heavy, and would go on and dominate the world on both sides of the Atlantic for about a year. And they were playing stuff like this. Of course, Led Zeppelin, that particular track, Rock and Roll, I felt defined more that, along with things like Kashmir and Black Dog, that more bluesy sound, as opposed to the more famous, and I must say, a song that I'm not a fan of, because you cannot go in a guitar shop anywhere in the world without hearing somebody playing Stairway to Heaven, and I just despise it because of what it represents with the pretentiousness. But there you go. So they were being formed, and now these three bands were all formed at the same time, but their influence made it out first because they were established musicians with contacts, and they released. But further north in the Midlands, there was another band that were actually formed the year before 1968, but they didn't release anything until 1970. And maybe it's because all four of those were from that much darker area, but their sound was much heavier, and went on to really invent an entire new genre of music, because if it wasn't for this band, there would be no such thing as heavy metal. And they hit the scene and really revolutionized everything that was going on with stuff like this. And that band, of course, is Black Sabbath, who really were the first heavy metal band with that much more riff-driven, thick, fuller sound generated just by one guitar, which really did influence stuff. Now, the third of these bands had probably a much quieter existence in some of the things they did, although they did revolutionize stuff in their own way. But it took them a longer period to do it, and they were more of a psychedelic nature. So I'm just going to change guitar. And that setting. And part of their music was very psychedelic, but part of it was very melodic as well. And they had a much more long-standing influence due to the longevity of their music and stuff like this as well. But they would have played stuff like this. course, is Pink Floyd, and the guitarist is Dave Gilmour. And that much more melodic sound, and I'm just going to have to go back and change the amp setting again to something a bit more raucous. Defines some of their more melodic work for a long time to come. And certainly Dave Gilmour's guitar work became legendary and influential. And then in the 1970s, whilst bands like Led Zeppelin were continuing to dominate and Black Sabbath became a behemoth around the world, and the Rolling Stones with legendary 2- and 3-year tours, there was nothing really that came along that changed much or defined anything until sometime in the middle of the decade. It was a movement more than a music that came along that was defined by clothes and attitude and a completely different outlook on life, and music accompanied that. And there was some guitar work in that came along that did change things a little bit again, and that would have been something like this. Obviously was punk, and that band was the Sex Pistols, and that guitarist was Steve Jones. And whilst it was short-lived, the impact that music had on British guitar music was long-lasting again. And even though they only had one album before really imploding on themselves before doing anything else, that did kind of last into the next generation. But we then had a break because in the late 70s we moved to disco, and in the early 80s new romantic and electronica. But then something came along that gave a platform for bands to put their message out there visually in a way that it hadn't before. And that platform was MTV. And early on MTV, one of the most played videos was by a British guitar band who'd come around in the late 70s but really became international stars at this time with heavy guitar music. Some of the earliest stuff is much more intricate, and this guitarist is one of the most talented ever to come out of these shores. But it was this that really defined them internationally when they came along and were able to make it marketable for MTV. Obviously, is Money for Nothing by Dire Straits, and the CGI video that they had was a big hit on MTV and really put them as 80 stars globally because of this. And the other band really, although they wouldn't come into this consideration, would have been something like Top, with the other band that really embraced this idea, and they completely reinvented themselves from being a Texas blues rock band to being a pop band with imagery and everything. But that was how that message came along. And guitar music had a bit of a mini renaissance, and then ended up with some stuff in the mid-80s. One band in particular and them, along with the Smiths, came around at that Manchester time. I'm not going to try and replicate Johnny Marr stuff, so please don't think that. But he was another one that came along, and that melodic riff-based picking sound, some advanced production techniques. I once heard Noel Gallagher say that Johnny Marr came in the studio with them and they asked him to play The Time Is Now, and he couldn't because not even Johnny Marr is as good as Johnny Marr, but it's the production techniques that made that happen. And this was the last time that anything significantly changed and got different. If you move beyond 1990, which is where the time scan I'm looking at, there's lots of guitar influences in there, but nothing is newer then. So the biggest guitar band of the 90s came from T-Rex, because the 70s had defined that type of music, even across the pond. Is a direct derivation of Deep Purple. So there was, the innovation has stopped at this point, and you could even go forward to much more recent stuff. Snow Patrol and the one before being Oasis, but the influences are taken from those pioneers. So you can trace a direct line, you can go beyond David Davis back to the 1950s and Lonnie Donegan and Hank Marvin and these people that came before, and the people from the US, people like Scotty Moore, James Burton, these people who were influencing much earlier on, Buddy Holly. They just kind of didn't have the same influence. The only one from that period that would have had the same influence would have been Chuck Berry. The reason I looked along and decided that is I've actually got a signed Chuck Berry guitar on the wall over there, that reminds me. But so the British guitarist progression really starts in 1964 with David Davis and gets all the way to Johnny Marr and John Squire in the late 80s, and then is just kind of replicating and regurgitating. There's nothing really explosive that comes out after that. That doesn't mean it's not good and it's not great and it's the era I grew up in, but there was no significant changes. So that's why the guitar hero, the British guitar hero, making influential changes and progressions really only spans the period from 1964 to 1990. Well, I hope you enjoyed this trip through it, and what I will say is I haven't done anything of my favourite guitarists, because this is just the progression of British guitarists on the way through, because obviously there's lots of people that have made massive contributions, people like Jeff Beck, Chuck Berry, Angus Young, Billy Gibbons, who we mentioned a little bit, Jimi Hendrix, all of these people, even people like Stevie Ray Vaughan, Eddie Van Halen, that made progressions in different ways, but they didn't come from that British lineage of influential guitarists. So that's why they weren't included in this video. Please feel free to put in the comments underneath. I will let you know that the paper I submitted passed, so this is just a summary of it. And I've enjoyed doing the research and putting it together. I hope you've enjoyed watching it. If you've got any discussion, please put it underneath. I'm more than happy to engage in discussion with everyone else. For anybody that was interested, the amp I'm using is an Orange 205T, I think it is. And the two guitarists are a Black Betty Gibson Les Paul Custom with a Bigsby Special and a Tobacco Burst Gibson Super Jumbo 220 with Fender cables. Just for the tech geeks out there. Okay, thank you very much for taking the time to watch. I hope it was enjoyable, and maybe we'll meet again sometime. Thank you.